Right. I'm in the background. I'll just turn my video off and leave you to.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on International Volunteer Managers Day. It's great to have you here joining us. I'll start with a karakia to open the session today. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, ki mā taratara ki tai, e hi ake ana ti atakura, he tio, he uka, he hauhu, ti he Māori ora. Ko Margaret McLaughlin toku ingoa. I'm Comms Manager at Volunteering New Zealand to our Aotearoa, and it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Johann, who is our Research Director, joining us from the UK, to tell us all about the State of Volunteering report and the findings that will be very interesting for us all. So welcome, Johann. Please take the floor.
Yeah, kia ora everyone, and thanks very much for joining us. I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully that's all fine. Great. Can I just check, Marg, if that's the right screen showing as well?
Yep. Yes, it's all good. We can see the intro.
Perfect. Yeah, apologies. Yeah, as I said, thanks very much, Marg. Thanks everyone for coming along. What we're going to talk about today is the latest State of Volunteering report that Volunteering New Zealand has written and published, which is the State of Volunteering New Zealand 2024. What we're going to do is just have a look at some of the highlights and some of the regional differences, as well as some graphics about what we think captures some of these insights. And then hopefully with some time also for Q&A through the chat. As Marg mentioned, I'm Johann. I'm a full-time academic, and in my part-time work, I also help Volunteering New Zealand with its research and help direct its research portfolio. One thing that has been really interesting to look at in the state of volunteering is to look at how things have changed post-COVID as well. And so a lot of what we're going to be looking at is how the volunteering landscape has changed in the time since COVID as well. But a little bit more about the state of volunteering. So the states of volunteering reports are biennial reports every 2 years, and they focus on the state of volunteering in Aotearoa New Zealand from the perspective of volunteers, organizations, and key stakeholders. We use a mixed methods research methodology, so we have both quantitative and qualitative research that underpins this research. And in this iteration, we had over 1,500 volunteer respondents and about 420 community and voluntary organizations. So these are key stakeholder organizations that we surveyed. And this report has been published also in various forms, but the most recent ones that I've led are the SOB 2020, 2022, and also a sub-report coming out of the 2022 report called the Regional Report, which looked a little bit further at the regional variations across volunteering. So I invite all of you to have a look at this if you're interested. These are available on the Volunteering New Zealand website. One interesting issue of how, as I said, we're going to look at today rather, is the changing landscape of volunteering. So I'm going to start a little bit by painting how volunteering has changed, both after COVID and also in response to more general socioeconomic changes. We're going to look at an enduring theme, which is motivations and barriers for volunteers. What makes people want to volunteer? What stops them from volunteering? We're then going to look at some challenges that are facing voluntary organizations. So these are everything from funding to administrative burdens. We're then going to look at evolving expectations for volunteers and voluntary organizations. So why are these changing? What do people want out of volunteering and what has been challenging, especially? We're then going to turn finally to the broad issue of ethical and inclusive volunteering. So how can we make volunteering more inclusive? How do different groups across different regions feel about volunteering, and are they included in the same way? But let's look at this first theme of the changing landscape. One really important feature that has come through in this recent survey is the pressures from the cost of living. So we're finding that a lot of volunteers are reporting a lower ability to be able to volunteer because, for example, they feel that they have to work instead of volunteer to make ends meet. We also feel that we also see, sorry, that a lot of organizations are saying that a lot of people are having to think twice about giving up more of their time when that same time could be used for paid employment. One other thing that we've noticed is what's known as the changing civic core. So the civic core is this idea that it's a small group of volunteers who perform the lion's share of volunteering hours. But in recent years, and including in this report, we've seen that there's been a big increase in casual volunteering. And what that means is that we're spreading the work of volunteering much more evenly now than perhaps it was over the past 10 years. So we see approximately 23% of volunteers give around 2 to 5 hours of volunteer work per month. But when we look at those who give 20 hours or more a month, so these are the sort of hardcore volunteers, these only really come to about 7.2%. And so there's been a shift in the figures of those who are really wanting to volunteer for small, periodic, or casual approaches as well. When we look at digitization, we find similar figures to previous years. So over half use no digital systems at all. And only about 22.9% of organizations use basic systems like Word or Excel. And so it's really interesting when we look at the changing landscape and why people, in a way, have found it challenging when there are no digital services. During COVID, we found that organizations struggled especially to coordinate volunteers if they were not already relatively digitized. When I mentioned the reports around people being put off by the cost of living, here are some reports about how people feel about volunteering in this cost of living crisis. So here is a quote, right? Our view is that most people can't afford to volunteer their time anymore due to the cost of living crisis. Or many younger people would like to do voluntary work, but need to work full time to meet household expenses. And current economic conditions have affected volunteer availability. So these are some observations by key stakeholders in the sector who have really noticed the same issue around this declining volunteer engagement, partly as a result of the cost of living. When we look at the time spent volunteering, I summarize a little bit about how this is changing. So when we look at the periodic stage up here around those who contribute 2 to 5 hours, we find this to be around 23.1%. When we look at those who give, over 20 hours, this is still a healthy proportion, but there's been a change towards much more casual or lower rates of volunteering, but sustained rather than merely something that they stop doing after 1 or 2 months or 1 or 2 years, depending on their commitment. So there's been this shift towards wanting to do their fair bit, but perhaps not doing 20 hours a month. When we look at the figures for the length of time people have spent volunteering, there's also a lot of people who have been serving for less than a year. So about 13.6% of people. And then there are also those who have served for a very long time, upwards of 15 years. And this aligns with previous understandings of how people volunteer and their behaviors. The second insights we look at in our states of volunteering reports are around what makes people want to volunteer and what are barriers and what stops people from volunteering. So we find that 82.8% of people volunteer to give back to the community. This is one of the reasons they give for volunteering, and there can be more than one reason. A lot of people emphasize the personal nature of volunteering motivations. So we'll come to this a little bit, but parts of why people are interested in volunteering often is that they have a personal link to the cause. So we hear of people who have personal experiences of cancer, or somebody who's been helped by a charity deciding to volunteer for that very same charity. We also see people who have private hobbies turning these into motivations for volunteering. One example is riding for the disabled, where we have people who are passionate about equestrian sports or about horse riding deciding to volunteer for something that helps the community. And so this is about turning private hobbies, which are things that people love doing anyway, into a very strong motivation for volunteering. But of course, there are also other barriers. So, one thing that came out really clearly in this year's report is around health and safety concerns. A lot of people really struggled with the health and safety issues around concerns for their personal well-being, whether this is in things like single crewed ambulance services or in the Maori warden work or in community patrol, these kinds of relatively high-risk situations compared to other kinds of volunteering. We also have a lot of volunteers who note that the lack of reimbursement for their expenses and the lack of recognition are important barriers for what stops them volunteering or what stops them volunteering as much. And this again aligns with previous reports of what we have noted about why people might stop volunteering or what might make people reluctant about volunteering. When we look at this reason, so again, multiple responses are allowed, but when we ask people, why do you want to volunteer? Why do you volunteer? We find that the most common reason is that it's to give back to the community. And this really aligns with the altruistic nature of how most of us see volunteering. But also immediately below that, we see a lot of reasons around making friends, making connections, the idea of whakawhanaungatanga, making connections, forging relationships that makes volunteering so attractive for lots of people. And this, again, are identified by many people as one of the reasons they volunteer and one of the motivations they volunteer. I mentioned the personal and social motivations, and here are some quotes about what we mean by this. So somebody said, "My friend died of cancer 20 years ago, and ever since I have volunteered for cancer-related causes. I was helped by the organization 23 years ago, and since that fateful day, I have wanted to volunteer to give back and to thank them for what they did for me." So this shows really how really effective community engagement can extend to attracting volunteers who then serve for a very long time with great loyalty. People always say, I volunteer to keep active. So this was an elderly volunteer who said that part of why they like volunteering is that it gets them out of the house, it gets them moving. And similarly, somebody said volunteering has improved my anxiety. This aligning with a view that volunteering has important well-being promoting factors and features. Aligning also with the last Labour administration's policies around the well-being budget, the well-being dimensions, and where volunteering was analysed as part of this well-being dimension. But when we look at barriers to volunteering, I already mentioned the cost of living crisis. And one thing we do see as well is some regional variations in this. So we know that in urban centres, large urban centres, Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, the cost of a living crisis is much more likely to influence volunteering retention and recruitment. And part of this is because it's more expensive to live in these large urban centres, but also because there are more opportunities for work. And so not only is it more expensive to give up work for volunteering, there are also other opportunities where you could work instead of volunteer. And at a time when you have to think about making ends meet, this can really be an important factor in making people's decisions about whether or not they volunteer. We also see some people talk about the emotional toll of some volunteer activities. So some people who volunteer in a care home, for example, noted that the number of people who died while they were on shift, or the number of people who would deteriorate rapidly, was an extremely emotionally taxing experience that really made them find volunteering very difficult. We also looked at some ambulance staff members who found the trauma and medical challenges to be very difficult to stomach as a volunteer over the long term. I also mentioned health and safety concerns around people thinking around whether they feel safe volunteering or whether more could be done. And a lot of this also came out during COVID. In the last report, people were concerned about infection. And so I think this concern about health and safety has really spilled over to more recent reports as well. The bureaucratic and administrative toll is something that's frequently mentioned by volunteers. Too much red tape, for example, is mentioned, too much administration, too many courses and requirements. These are to do with the challenges that we expect people to do in order to comply with volunteering regulations. And this is something that we hear again and again around why people might find volunteering challenging or less attractive. There are also challenges facing organizations alongside those that I explored that set up a barrier to individual volunteers. So the same administration and bureaucracy also poses a challenge to organizations, especially small organizations that have to think about their day-to-day administration or perhaps have very few staff to comply with a lot of these administrative tasks. So a lot of organizations, for example, talk about the amount of paperwork involved, the amount of compliance work, both before and after the review of the incorporated societies legislation. A lot of organizations talk about funding challenges. And one thing that's really interesting is a lot of organizations survive year by year. They apply for grants that decide whether or not that organization will exist really for the next financial year. And a lot of organizations, especially small ones, find this very challenging because you find yourself working really for your existence. And especially if it's a short-term funding pot where you have to apply year by year, instead of discharging community services, a lot of your time is spent really balancing the books or making sure you're still around for the next financial year. Aging volunteers is also a challenge that has been noted not only in this report, but in all our previous states of volunteering reports. So around half of organizations report that aging volunteers is amongst the biggest challenges. And we've noticed this figure go up since last year as well, since the last report as well. Alongside this, just a little over half also report that not enough volunteers is their biggest challenge. Again, also an increase from 2022. So together with these two challenges, noting that people can tick multiple options, we've really seen that this concern about aging volunteers for succession planning and the future-proofing of the organization, alongside simply there not being enough volunteers, has really been a challenge for a lot of organizations. When we look at turnover rates and regional disparities, we find also that this is not evenly spread. So we find that turnover rates are much higher again in the large urban centers than they are in smaller or rural areas. And part of the reason, again, is that in larger areas, there are many more options for volunteering. So if you don't like somewhere, you can easily find an alternative volunteering activity. Or perhaps you move cities or you move suburbs within that big urban area. And so it's easier to then find a new volunteering activity. Within smaller rural areas, we find that turnover rates are actually lower. And part of this could be a sense of community or a sense of belonging, but also it seems that people say that there are fewer options to choose from when you're in a rural area. And so because they want to give back to their communities, they basically just decide to stick with the organization that they feel can best meet their requirements for contributing to the community. But this shows some of the differences in turnover rates by geography across New Zealand. When we look at the overall metrics for how much of an organization's workforce has left in the last 12 months, we find that this is fairly consistent with previous years. So a healthy proportion of 20% say that no one has left the organization in the past 12 months. But the most common answer, the modal group, is that between 5 and 10% of their organization's workforce has left in the last 12 months. And about just under half of organizations report this figure. When we look at those who report, that over 20% of their organization has left, we reach about 12.5% here. So this is on the higher side. But in general, it's encouraging to see that turnover rates have stayed fairly consistent across the different stages of the report. We then look at the evolving expectations and attitudes that volunteers and voluntary organizations have. Because part of what's really interesting is with the rise of social media, with the rise of different social events and demographic changes, we've seen a lot of challenges in how people look at why they volunteer and what they want out of volunteering. So there's now this demand that volunteering should be fun and it should not be like work. So people are no longer happy to just volunteer for the sake of doing something that maybe they might not enjoy, but they feel like they have to do out of obligation. There is this view now that volunteering should be something fun and something that is different from work. At the same time, there is this strong view that volunteering should be skills-based rather than labor-based. And what that means is a lot of people feel like when they volunteer, they're volunteering their time and skills and not merely their time. So that means they're not happy with tasks, for example, like cleaning or merely picking up rubbish, which, important though it is, a lot of volunteers now want things that align with their skills. So they want, for example, to use their accounting skills for an organization, or they want to use their skills in healthcare for a particular organization. So there's this move towards demanding that volunteering activities should be based on their skill or wanting to use their skill to contribute to the betterment of society rather than merely doing generic labor, as one participant described. There's also this rejection of rhetoric, this rhetoric of volunteering as an obligation. Um, we actually had a few organizations who thought that volunteering should be a condition of receiving social welfare. Um, that's not the view that we take, partly because volunteering should be voluntary. The clue is in the name. But there is this, nonetheless, there's both within political circles and social circles, there is this evolving view that volunteering should be something compulsory, perhaps, for all those on welfare benefits, as some people say. But at the same time, there is a strong push against younger people in particular of seeing volunteering as an obligation, because volunteering, in their view, is something that is a voluntary task. That's something that we contribute because we want to, and out of love or mahi aroha, to use the Maori word. We're here to basically work and not as an obligation. And so there's this at the same time as this rise in the rhetoric of obligation, there is a response also that volunteering is something that should not be like that. What's also interesting is when we look at the post-COVID volunteering landscape, we've found a lot of volunteers pivoting towards health-related causes. So more people volunteering for the ambulance, for example, for health and social care services in hospitals and other related causes. One of the things we asked for in the State of Volunteering report is this very broad yardstick that we call the State of Volunteering report. So basically, overall, how do you feel that the sector in New Zealand is as a whole? And this is a deliberately broad question. Volunteers on average rated at 6.8 and organizations 6.3 out of 10. And what's interesting is that in most years, volunteers rate the state of volunteering much higher than organizations, which is to say that volunteers are much more optimistic about the volunteering space than perhaps those who are working in the sector full time or professionally. The final theme we want to look at is this rhetoric around inclusive and ethical volunteering. What's great to know is that the majority of people enjoy volunteering and feel respected. The most volunteers, however, who are under sorry, let me rephrase. Volunteers under the age of 26, on the other hand, are less likely to feel valued, while volunteers over the age of 76 are more likely to be valued. And in fact, those over the age of 80, for example, are the most likely to feel like they are valued by their organization. Maori volunteers are most likely to be valued, while Asian volunteers are normally the least valued based on perceptions of value. And Maori are also most likely to give the state of volunteering a 10 out of 10. One explanation I've given for this high rating for Maori is that a lot of Maori volunteering takes place within marae, for example, and within local communities. And so if indeed we're right that a lot of Maori volunteering takes place within these local cultural contexts, then senses of belonging and value are much more likely to be higher within these local contexts. After all, if you feel like you belong to the marae and you're volunteering within the marae, then the sense of belonging is much more likely to be very high. When we look at this graphic, and again, I don't need people to look at the whole thing, but when we look at the most common responses in the zero column, you find that this peak here corresponds with the belonging statement. So the statement that is most likely to get a rating of strongly disagree is to do with volunteering. Looking to the far right, on the other hand, on the orange column, we find that the statement most likely to get a score of 5 strongly agree is the fact of people saying that they enjoy volunteering with the organization. And so there's a very high satisfaction rate in general that people love volunteering for their organization. When we look at diversity and inclusion metrics across New Zealand, organizations tend to self-report how they feel. And so about 11.1% of volunteering organizations think that they do not reflect any diversity within Aotearoa New Zealand. When we look at the others, it's varying degrees of whether they reflect some, all, or perhaps most of New Zealand's diversity. And this, again, has been fairly constant, with slight signs of improvement over the years. One way to conclude this talk is to look at some recommendations for how we can improve the sector. And this is something that Volunteering New Zealand has started doing in its recent reports. So one thing that we've always emphasized and have campaigned for a long time is the need for better population level data. The State of Volunteering report is very valuable, but it's limited in its sample size. It's not a global census across New Zealand, for example. So we know that Statistics New Zealand has the data, but we would support the need for these to be regularly published and analyzed at scale in order to help the community and voluntary sector. We also think that grant-making organizations should look at funding cycles over a longer time horizon. So instead of grants being awarded for 1-year periods, we could look perhaps to 2 to 3 or even 5-year periods where grants are operated on a longer time scale. Because this relieves some of the pressure for smaller organizations to think and plan year by year instead of focusing on delivering some of their services. We also think that in general, the sector needs to revise its volunteer practices and processes to meet the changing times and challenges. And so this means, just as we did during COVID, we revised and adapted. We also think that this is the same in general when we look at demographic and socioeconomic challenges. And of course, we always need to have a strategic view of volunteering engagement, retention, and management. So this means looking at opportunities, analyzing risk, and pushing for funding to create a whole sector volunteer strategy that targets particular groups, youth volunteering strategies, for example, and other sectors that are priority groups for engagement. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to any questions, and I'm also very happy to receive any email inquiries after the talk. If you don't get a chance to answer your questions, I've shared my email on the screen there as well. But thank you very much, and I'll pass on to Marg.
Well, kia ora, Johann. I always enjoy hearing you talk and your great insights. Does anybody, please feel free to pop something into the Q&A if you've got a specific question. Johann, I was wondering if you can elucidate just a bit more about any standout regional differences. I know this time, instead of doing a separate report, we really tried to put the regional differences as part of the report. I know you mentioned about turnover as being different in the regions. Were there any other insights that you could share about that?
Yeah, sure, of course. So turnover, I mentioned, is one metric that is relatively different across the regions. One thing we also find is actually the average length of time served in volunteering organizations. And so this is obviously a follow-on from turnover. But we find that on average, people in rural areas spend about 5 years longer than they do in urban areas. And this might perhaps reflect the demographics or the community mindset, but we find that there's a much stronger kind of pivot towards staying longer within an organization in rural areas. When we look at the cost of living crisis, we find that the challenges are, in a way, much more, as I said, much more acute and a much stronger barrier in the urban centers. But one thing that's really interesting when we look at more of the narrative, the qualitative data around the regions, is that there seems to be much more availability of services in rural areas for in terms of cost of living challenges. So this is not something we expected, right? We would expect the large food banks, for example, to be in the large urban centers. But one thing we find is that the community organizations that focused on direct help, food banks, these kinds of things, these were much stronger and much more prevalent in the smaller rural and even the smaller urban communities than there were in the larger urban centers. And so that was just something that really helps to frame this kind of maybe this communitarian mindset around what volunteering involves within these different regions.
Right. Someone's just asked if we've got a figure of the percentage change of volunteers in New Zealand between 2020, say, and nowadays. I know this is one of the challenges with statistics from on a population level. The most recent figures I think we have is from 2021. Is that right?
Mhm. Yeah, so this is a great question, and I think it also highlights what we've been pushing for Statistics New Zealand. So the stats are out there to analyze. It partly depends how we measure volunteering. So if we define it as unpaid work for a household outside your own, then that figure changes. I don't have the figure off the top of my head, partly because we would not use our own figures to arrive at that analysis. We would look to the Statistics New Zealand data. It's called the Quarterly Labour Market Statistics, so it's available online. The data sets around the labour market statistics show the proportion of people in unpaid work, including by volunteering. And that's actually something we've been pushing Stats New Zealand to publish much more regularly, because the unpaid work statistics around the quarterly labour market stats are really important and one of the only population level data we have that's accurate and regular. So as I said, it's not the kind of thing we can answer from our own survey because we only do a very small segment. But Stats New Zealand do have the much fuller data set for people engaged in unpaid work. And if we extend that definition to what we're doing, then that gives you a broad survey. But I would recommend looking on the Stats New Zealand website for the full data on that.
Yeah, my recollection is that if you look at that, how much unpaid work have you done outside your household in the last 4 weeks? Between 2018 and 2021, it actually increased slightly from just under 50% to just over. So people are actually recognizing that they're doing more, which is a good thing.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Another question here. Do you have any information on the increased reliance on volunteers to supplement paid workforce within organizations?
This is a very good question. In a way, we've actually found a slightly so firstly, it's very hard to generalize across this thing, but we do one thing with that's always a challenge with volunteering as an activity is that especially in larger organizations that have a mixed workforce, such as the ambulance service, for example, with volunteers, is you don't want to have a situation where paid workforce are displaced or are prevented from being paid properly because, for example, you could just use volunteers to cover their work. There's a lot of debate around the role of volunteers, for example, to cover striking paid workforce members. But these complications aside, we don't have any evidence that volunteers are replacing paid workforce in an active sense. But what actually we do have interesting evidence of is there's been an increased professionalization of the sector. So we're actually finding that a lot of managers of volunteers, when they were once unpaid, are now doing it in a paid capacity. So in a way, it's the opposite to perhaps what the questioner is asking, where we have increasing numbers of volunteers, volunteer managers who were once unpaid, now doing it in a paid capacity, not necessarily full time, but being paid. And we think also strategically, this is a good thing because we want to see volunteer management seen as a profession that is also kept with appropriate remuneration and valued accordingly. And part of having a professional workforce of volunteer managers is for people to be able to see it as a professional vocation. But in general, we have not seen paid workers being displaced.
Thank you. Just a question around, is there any data available breaking down responses region by region? We've gone to that level of detail?
So it's always possible. The thing comes down to funding. So it's very labor intensive to do a lot of the analysis and the coding to basically break down region by region. So we have a very small team in VNZ. And so part of our strategy and our longer term plans are to apply for funding to work with other organizations, perhaps to be able to do this on a very regular basis and with much more detail. So in our report, we've looked at some general trends around some priority areas like inclusion and turnover rates, as well as length of service. But there's much more that can be done cross-sectionally and also in terms of looking at different correlations across regions metrics. And our aim strategically and hopefully over the medium term is to partner with an organization that can provide the funding and the expertise for us both to conduct these. But the short answer is it's possible in principle. We have a lot of data, not all of it, but we would be pushing Stats New Zealand and also other organizations to come on board with this project, basically.
Thank you. And the question of, can you talk more about the different experiences of ethnic communities and new migrants?
Sure. So this is a really good question again. So firstly, in 2019, I co-led a report called The Recent Migrant Strategy. So this was in conjunction with Volunteering New Zealand, the Department of Internal Affairs, and the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment. And this was a government-funded report that looked at how recent migrant volunteers could better be integrated into the New Zealand sector, both to help them prepare for work, as well as to allow them to meet new friends, learn English, so on and so forth. So that report is on the Volunteering New Zealand website, and it's called the Recent Migrant Strategy around how we come up with this. But in general, when we look at recent migrant volunteers, to echo some of what the report found, we find that there's a lot of opportunity for people who are very enthusiastic to contribute to their new society. There's a big engagement in wanting to connect with their community. And so there's definitely enthusiasm there, and also a willingness to learn and contribute. But it also comes with risks, both for volunteers and organizations engaging them. So in terms of risks, we're very aware of the fine line between exploitation and volunteering. So when there are recent migrants involved who are doing unpaid labor, it's especially important that we have full consent and full understanding that this work that's done of their own free will, because they want to help others and not in lieu of payment or with the false promise of future employment, or the idea that this is going to help their residency, for example. And so part of the strategy is learning to balance these competing demands for people to see volunteering as something useful and something enjoyable, but not something that would exploit people and something that they would do instead of paid employment. But when we look at all the inclusivity statistics around what the questioner mentioned, we do sadly find that recent migrants and minority ethnic groups tend to be less represented in community and voluntary organizations, and they tend to have less enjoyable times in general. So I mentioned Asian New Zealand volunteers having the lowest perception of being valued by their organization. So I think there's definitely more work to be done on why that's the case. There are some working hypotheses, but there's definitely needs to be much more evidence on that. In the last SOV, we ran focus groups actually with particular volunteers, and some of these range from very simple bullying to more subtle, cues around perhaps the environment not aligning with what they expect. And so I think in future work, there's much more to focus groups of um, how we look at the experiences of different migrants.
Thanks. Am I right in thinking too, Johann, that we're looking at doing a sort of a look forward, sort of 10 years of state of volunteering and what we've learned over that time and what the future trends might be?
That's right. So I think one of my projects that I'm just going to start on with the team is to look at, in a way, a state of the volunteering or state of the decade with volunteering. So when we take a stand back and look at how volunteering has evolved, both, after a global pandemic, with the rise of social media and different kinds of engagement, different kinds of pressures, how has that really changed how people see volunteering? And also, Aotearoa New Zealand has seen rapid demographic change, not just over the past 10 years, but beyond that. But we haven't really looked at how that's affecting how volunteering is perceived or how volunteering is perhaps looked at by different parts of society and different cultures. We started some work on this when we looked at how Māori view volunteering and how mahi aroha is a different concept perhaps to volunteering, where Māori might not consider what they're doing to be volunteering. They might just think it's part of caring for one another or one's family. And so there's definitely a lot of scope around, firstly, conceptualizing volunteers in a much more robust way. And secondly, also looking at just the key trends, and then looking to the future. How can we scan the horizon to stay one step ahead of the changing nature of volunteering?
Awesome. Does anybody have any more questions for us today? In that case, I will just like to thank you so much, Johann, for sharing your expertise. It's always lovely working with you. And I'll close us with a karakia, and I hope you all have a wonderful International Volunteer Managers Day. It's a good chance to lift your head up, I think, from the day-to-day busyness and just think about what you can do and what you are doing to really improve things for volunteering. I'll just close us with a karakia. Kia whakaere te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuku whātia ha ai, kia turuku whaka tahe ai, haume hui e, tae ki e. Kia ora everyone. Thank you.